Well, good morning, church. Typically, it's Brad that's leading us through our sermon series. Brad, as he mentioned last week, had surgery this Thursday, just a few days ago. A second neck surgery. Talked to him yesterday. He's doing well. Surgery was very successful. He's just recovering now. He showed me the incision on the back of his neck, and I don't do well with those kinds of things. I asked him to promise me he'd never do anything like that again. But he's doing well, and he wants you to know he's looking forward to being back with us. Just a little teaser. 2 weeks from today, he's going to be here live at our Dripping Springs campus, and he's going to be broadcasting from here to the other campuses, and so looking forward to seeing him there. But for now, 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Let's all look at 2 Corinthians chapter 6. And as you turn there to 2 Corinthians chapter, we're going to go through the whole chapter 6 today, and we're going to tag on along with chapter 6, the very first verse of chapter 7. Because whoever it was, 400 or 500 years ago that started putting chapters and verses into the scriptures really messed up in his ordering here. So verse number 1 of chapter 7 really goes with the thought of chapter 6, and so we're going to look at all of that today. But to kind of seed things this morning, I want to ask you. I want you to do me a favor. I want you to pretend just for a second. Pretend you're a 14-year-old kid. You're a 14-year-old boy. You're a 14-year-old girl. You're upstairs at home in your bedroom, and you're doing whatever 14-year-olds do up there in the bedroom. And you hear your parents call from downstairs that dinner's ready. Hey, dinner's ready. And so the question is, what's your response? Do you do you completely ignore them? B, do you say, I'm coming, and then completely ignore them? Do you say, I'm busy, I'm going to be there as soon as I can? Or do you D, move promptly from your bedroom to the dining room with joy and gratitude in your heart for whatever mom or dad has prepared to eat, huh? Today we're talking about responsiveness. Today we're talking about action, about really our response to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, remember this. This is what Brad has beat in our heads the past weeks. 2 Corinthians is a letter. It's a letter from the Apostle Paul to his church in Corinth. It is a letter of explanation. It's a letter of encouragement. It's a letter of heartfelt appeal, and it was needed because the church in Corinth right now is angry with their pastor, is doubting their pastor. And the reason is because Paul has said, I can't wait. I'm going to come visit you. I know I've been absent from you for a while. I'm going to come back and visit you. And circumstances fell to where he was unable to do that, unable to make good on his word. And they held that against him. It sounds like kind of a petty thing, but he was explaining, here's what happened. Here's why I couldn't do what I said I was going to do. But it was more than just that their expectations on his arrival were up here and those expectations went unmet. What was also going on in the background is there was a group there in Corinth of professional pastors. And they had kind of wormed their way in, and they were teaching the Corinthian church some things that were contrary to what their pastor Paul had taught them. They were teaching them some things that were absolutely against and contrary to the simple gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, we know the gospel of Jesus Christ is Jesus plus what? It's Jesus plus nothing. But these guys were saying, yes, Jesus, absolutely Jesus, but along with Jesus, we also have to keep some of the Old Testament law. Along with Jesus, we have to keep some of the Jewish traditions. And so Paul had tried to work it into their minds that any reliance upon anything other than who Jesus is and what he's done for us, any reliance on anything else, totally dilutes and turns the gospel into something that is not the gospel, turns the good news into something that is no longer good news. And so Paul is making this appeal in this letter, a heartfelt appeal. Don't do it. Don't move from dead center over the gospel to something else that looks nice and shiny. These professional pastors were saying, you know what? They were undermining Paul. They were saying, Paul is really not a real pastor. He's not a real apostle. He doesn't have credentials. He doesn't have letters of recommendation. He doesn't speak as eloquently as what we do. He's not charismatic enough. And so Paul, this 2 Corinthians is the most transparent and raw letter that Paul ever wrote. His emotions are out there. But Paul is kind of drawing a line in the sand. He gets a bit more bold. He gets a bit more blunt here. And so in verse number 1 of chapter 6, here's what Paul writes. He says, working together with him, working together with God, then we appeal to you not to receive the grace of God in vain. Now that's the whole deal today. That's the whole deal of what Paul is trying to get across, not just in this chapter, not just in this portion of the letter, but the whole letter of 2 Corinthians. Do not receive the grace of God in vain. He goes on in verse number 2 and he kind of teases it out some. He says, here's why. He says, for he, God says, and then he quotes an Old Testament line from Isaiah chapter 49. He says, in a favorable time, I listened to you. In a day of salvation, I helped you. And the Jewish audience that were listening to this, they would have known right away exactly what was going on in the context of this line from Isaiah 49 that he was quoting. He was basically saying this. He says, listen, when Jesus tugs at your heart, move, act. Don't ignore God. Don't postpone God. Act. It doesn't matter your intentions, doesn't matter your delayed aspirations, you act now. Because when God is saying, hey, I'm inviting you to come and to trust me in who I am, whether that's for salvation or for sanctification as you continue to follow him, the time to act is now. He says now is the day of salvation. Now is the favorable time. And anytime we delay, we are forfeiting. We are receiving the grace of God absolutely in vain. And so in order to kind of understand this, what Paul is talking about right here, there's two things that we have to understand. Number one, you've got to understand, you've got to grasp, along with Paul, what the grace of God really is. Okay? Grace is the way and the only way that God ever interacts with us, God ever engages. Everything that God does on behalf of his creation, you and I, is through grace. Everything is a means of grace. Every time that he calls us and invites us is a means of grace. Every conviction, every reproof is grace. Every encouragement, every comfort is grace. Every teaching, it's all of grace. Grace is the only way that God deals with us. He has to. And this isn't something that's new. This goes all the way back to the very origins of creation. Genesis chapter 1 is filled with the grace of God. Grace is not a New Testament concept. Grace didn't begin with Jesus. It was certainly and perfectly personified in Jesus. As a matter of fact, in John chapter 1, the Apostle John actually says, when Jesus came on the scene and we beheld, we were able to see his glory. The glory as if the one and only Son of God, full of grace and truth. Full of grace and truth. Not the balance of grace and truth, but the full embodiment of both grace and truth. So with Jesus, there is no conflict between grace and truth. There's a conflict with you and me with grace and truth. We either lean one way or we lean the other. Is this, as I discipline my kids or as I deal with a coworker, is this a time for grace or is this a time for truth? Jesus, no, these two are not in conflict with one another. As a matter of fact, grace doesn't dumb down sin. Grace doesn't dilute sin. It doesn't minimize sin. It doesn't make sin more palatable or less severe. Here's what grace does. Grace fully acknowledges all the implications of sin and sinfulness, and yet it doesn't condemn. Instead, it rescues and empowers. Someone once said that here's what God's grace is in all of our life. Everything that God does within you and me, everything that he does with us in order to conform us into the image of his Son, Jesus Christ. And so in order to understand what Paul's getting at here, when he says, please, 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 my family, my children, my spiritual children, do not receive God's grace in vain. We have to understand what God's grace is. And it's such a deep subject, we don't have time to unpack it all right now. But the second thing we need to understand, because of Paul's appeal, is that we can actually forfeit the grace of God. You can actually receive God's grace and it have no effect. You can receive it in vain. Now that should concern all of us. But the grace of God can actually, and it can come to us. It can visit us in all of its promise, in all of its power, and we can waste it. We can forfeit it. We can actually miss out on God's best. All the good, all the growth, all the glory that he wants to share, we can miss it. And so what does that look like? How does the grace of God visit somebody and we forfeit it, we waste it? We receive it in vain. What does that look like? Listen, every time that you and every time that I choose not to trust God in the moment, we forfeit the grace of God. Every time that you and I don't yield to the prompting of the Spirit in our life, we receive the grace of God in vain. Every time that you and I don't walk in the Spirit, don't keep in step with the Spirit, as it talks about in Galatians chapter 5. Every time that we don't stay connected to God, every time that we don't abide in him and let his word abide in us, John chapter 15, we forfeit the grace of God. We receive the grace of God in vain. In summary, every time that you and I choose not to trust and obey God, we receive his grace in vain. You ever ask yourself, how come I'm not growing as a Christian like I should? How come there's not any more God stories? How come there's no bigger faith stories? How come there's no transformation of my character? Not as much as I think should go. Why is it? Oftentimes it's because you and I, we comprehend the right things. We say we believe the right things, but we stop short of obedience. You know what we're good at? We're good at listening and learning. We're good at understanding and pondering. We're good at assessing and agreeing, but we stop short of obeying Jesus. Let me ask you a question. How can you and I demonstrate faith in Jesus apart from obedience? I'm waiting. How can you and I really demonstrate, I really trust you, your goodness, your character, and your word, and your will, and your commands of mine. I trust apart from obedience. The truth is that we can't. We can't. Well, what could that obedience look like? I mean, what could it actually look like to kind of miss out on the grace of God? It's really simple. We do it all the time. Tell you a story. Some of you know I've shared the story of my niece. I have a niece. Her name is Courtney. And so she's a follower of Jesus, has been since she was young. And so some years ago, she called me up and she said, hey, Uncle Greg, so here's the deal. I'm a Jesus follower. I really do believe that Jesus is the Son of God. I believe that he's God with skin on. I believe that he went to the cross willingly to pay for my sins, and I have put all of my trust for today and tomorrow on him. I cannot save myself. She says, I'm a Christian, and I believe the scriptures, I believe the Bible is the authority of my life, and I'm gay. And I have this thing inside of me. These two things cannot be reconciled. Uncle Greg, can I come spend a summer with you and Aunt Janie? Because I want to talk about this. And so she flew out from Florida to Austin, and so she spent about 6 weeks with us during the summer, and we had a lot of conversations. And I remember that very first conversation where she says, "Uncle Greg, here's the deal. I believe Jesus, and I follow the scriptures, and I'm gay." I said, "Stop for a minute. Why do you identify yourself with that word?" I said, "Do you follow Jesus?" "Yes." "Do you believe the scriptures?" "Yes." "Shouldn't you identify yourself with what your heavenly Father says is true about you?" Why do you adopt a word or a phrase or an identity that the culture has placed upon you? Now, this may be your inclination. It may be a drive inside of you, a desire inside, but it's not your identity. It's not who you are. This may be who you feel, but it's not who you are. So let's start there. That was the very first conversation that we had with her. And then over 6 weeks, we had conversation after conversation after conversation, most of them dealing with the difference between feeling and faith, the difference between temptation and sin, the difference between inclination and desire and actually obeying and trusting Jesus. We had these great conversations, but it all came down to a final conversation a couple of days before she left that had to hinge on this verse out of the Gospel of Mark. This verse in Mark chapter 8 says this. Jesus had been teaching, and it says, and calling the crowd to him with his disciples. And so note this, look up here for a minute. In this crowd, there were both disciples of Jesus and then the crowd. Everybody that's listening to Jesus and following Jesus, not necessarily a disciple. This was a mixed bunch, just like churches every Sunday, just like your Mondays through Saturdays are full of believers and non-believers. And so Jesus was calling the crowd to him with his disciples, and here's what he said to them. He said, if anyone would come after me, he would need to deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Courtney, how about denying self and following Jesus? Well, you've trusted Jesus with your life, right? Yes. You trusted Jesus with your eternity, right? You think you could trust Jesus with your sexuality? You think you can trust Jesus with your desires? Well, Uncle Greg, does that mean I can never have a girlfriend? Courtney, how about denying self? Because self is what Jesus is consistently trying to rescue us from. All of the self in here that hinders and covers up the real me, the one that I was created, the life I was created to live, to give up so that I can live into the life that I was actually created for. Are you willing to trust Jesus with this? Well, does this mean I can never get married? I don't know, Courtney. Are you willing to trust Jesus in this area of your life? Well, does this mean I'm going to die old and alone? I don't know. And this conversation went on. Will you just trust Jesus? And that was pretty much the end of the conversation. And with no real strong reconciliation, she got on the plane and went back to Florida. Well, that was years ago. She's 25 years old now. She lives here in Austin. And she's married now to a guy. And a couple of years ago, they were at the house, and the whole family was at the house. And Courtney and I were in the living room, and it was just the two of us. And I said, hey, Court, I said, so love your husband. And it's like, so remember back in the day when you flew out here and you came, we spent that summer? And she said, yeah. I said, explain yourself. You know, what happened? She says, well, here's the deal. I still find myself physically and emotionally attracted to females. But what I know is I am strongly physically attracted and strongly emotionally attracted to this guy. And I said, isn't that just so Jesus? Aren't you glad you did not receive the grace of God in vain? Aren't you glad you didn't say, I'm going to go my own way? I know what God says, but I know what I feel. Aren't you glad you didn't forfeit the grace of God? Now listen, there's 1,001 ways that we can apply this. Those of you who are chronic worriers, you're Enneagram 6s, you just can't help to kind of see things, worst case scenario, glass half empty kind of people. Listen, this is an opportunity for you to not receive the grace of God in vain. Worry is unproductive meditation. And the cure to it is that every time you feel the pinch of life inside of you, you know what you do? Is you pray. The scriptures always coach you to go to the Lord and cast all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. Jesus, in modeling what prayer should look like, actually says, ask the Father, give us today our daily bread. Please meet my needs today. To be anxious about nothing, but in everything by prayer and petition. Worry is unproductive meditation. Prayer is very, very productive meditation. Worry is the fruit of choosing not to believe in God's goodness and God's promises that he will not only supply all that you need, but he is all that we need. And listen, when Christians pray, they worry less. And when Christians worry, it's because we're prayerless. And so the grace of God is extended to you in that moment. The thing is, are you going to receive that grace in vain? Or are you going to rely on the promises of God? How about those of us that there's people in our life that we hate? And now you would say, there's nobody that I really hate. Well, who is it that you haven't forgiven? Because Jesus equates hate with resentment and unforgiveness? Who is it that you've cut out of your life because they wounded you or they neglected you or they didn't follow through on a promise? Who is it that there is bitterness and resentment and unresolved and ungiven forgiveness in your life? Because every time an opportunity to pray for that person, every opportunity that we're given to bless that person, to show kindness to that person that, yes, wounded you, made a promise and failed on that promise. Every time you have that opportunity and you say no, you're receiving the grace of God in vain. Listen, disobedience is the refusal to act in faith. It doesn't matter what we say. We believe and that we trust Jesus. Trust Jesus for what? Trust Jesus when? Once upon a time when I prayed a prayer, or today? Today, right now, moment by moment. Disobedience is a refusal to act, and it's very, very costly. I can remember one of the last conversations I had with my brother before he passed away at the age of 32. He says, Greg, my life has been wasted. As a child of God, I chose my own way, thought I was bigger and badder and smarter. I thought I was convinced. Remember what the Old Testament teaches us? That there is a way that actually seems right to man, but in the end it leads to death. That is why Jesus is trying to get us to rescue us from self and saying, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. So he says, Paul, in this opening line of what we call chapter 6 of 2 Corinthians, he says, behold, now is the time to move. Now is the acceptable time. Now is the day of salvation. Let me ask you a question. Let me ask you it this way. Why would you want to delay obedience to Jesus? In the things that are aspects of your life that you know do not honor him, the addictions and the attitudes and the hang-ups and the passivity that you know do not honor him, those areas of disobedience, why do you want to delay your obedience? Why do you want to extend your disobedience? Why? That's why Paul is saying, today is the day to act. Today. He goes on, verse number 3, he says this. He says, listen, church, we put no obstacle in anyone's way, so that no fault may be found with our ministry, but as servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way. He's explaining himself again. He knows that there's some people that are whispering in the ears of the people that he has shepherded into the gospel. And he says, as servants of God, here's how we commend ourselves. Here's how we prove that we're the real deal. He says, by great endurance. Listen to this. In afflictions and hardships and calamities and beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger. And then wonderful things. Areas of victory. By purity and knowledge, patience, kindness, the Holy Spirit, genuine love, by truthful speech, by the power of God, with weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left, through honor and dishonor, through slander and praise. We are treated as impostors, and yet we're true, as unknown and yet well known, as dying, and behold, we live, as punished and yet not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing, yet we possess everything. Paul was letting those Corinthian readers know, maybe some of them that were not fully aware of circumstances in his life, or maybe they had forgotten, but he's also addressing the fact that there were these professional ministers that were discrediting Paul and whispering into the ears of those believers, trying to actually giving those Corinthian believers a false gospel. Saying, look at Paul. Look at Paul's life. See all that stuff he's gone through? See all the hardship in his life? That's proof. That's proof that he's not the real deal. Because if he really was of God, if he really was a spokesperson for God, then you know what? His life these things wouldn't happen to him. God would protect him. It's an absolutely false gospel. It's wrong. Now, again, I really want to get this across to us. Listen, here's the truth. There are fixed stars and there are shooting stars. If you're a fan of the cosmos at all, if you ever looked up at the night sky and looked at it through a telescope, you know that it's pretty cool to be able to see a star and all of its brilliance and kind of understand that thing. Fixed stars are great to look at, but they're nothing compared to shooting stars. Shooting stars are rare. Fixed stars, oh my gosh, you can't even count them. But shooting stars, you don't always see those things. But they are bright and dazzling. They only last for 2 or 3 seconds. You are lucky if you look at them. Hey, listen, here's the deal. Shooting stars, way more sexy than fixed stars. Paul was a fixed star. The Judaizers, these people that said Jesus plus do these things, people that were trying to discredit Paul, they were shooting stars. Remember Brad teaching us through 2 Corinthians that Paul just kind of came out and said, here's the deal, I don't speak as eloquently as some people. There's not a lot of sizzle in what I do. I'm just sharing the simple gospel of Jesus, the freeing gospel of Jesus, the thing that actually changes people from the inside out, the thing that rescues us from our sorry, self-focused selves. I'm just giving you that. Absence of all the drama, absent of all the sizzle, all the dazzle, all the thing. I'm not trying to entertain you. Paul was a fixed star. Shooting stars in Christendom, they come and go. We had some of our ministry, our church is full of hundreds and hundreds of volunteers, and there was a ministry team that had a ministry team meeting over at my house. Every now and then we like to host ministry team meetings, and so there was like 15, 16 ministry leaders that are in our church. Some of you are in the audience right now, over at my house about a week ago. And we were just having fun and played some silly games. And it was just, the energy was fantastic. But there was a time toward the end of the evening where I just gathered everybody in the living room around chairs. And I just wanted to share my heart with them and say, thank you for what you do. What you're doing is you're living out the New Testament. You're actually being who God created you to be. You're not only blessing the church and blessing our community by serving, but your act of serving is actually doing something inside of you. Because sometimes, as Paul has pointed out right here in this text, sometimes ministry is hard. Sometimes life is hard. That's just kind of the way it is. There's a whole lot of sowing. Sometimes it's hard. And one of the things that makes it hard is sometimes you sow and you sow and you sow, and it's a long time before you see fruit. And we like immediate results. We like instant gratification. But the faith is in the sowing and the waiting, the sowing and the waiting, and the sowing and the waiting. And I was primarily talking to people that work in student ministry around here, people that work in children's ministry around here. You're always sowing, and you're always sowing. Isn't this true, parents? You're always sowing. And sometimes it's a long, long time before you see fruit, and you can get discouraged. And I encourage you, be a fixed star. And don't attach yourself to shooting stars. Here's something else I'd like to, while I have the platform, something I want to say about Brad that Brad really can't say for himself. I'm so thankful that I serve shoulder to shoulder with a lead pastor of a growing church that's a fixed star. That he's been here for 19 years this coming summer. And he is the same guy I've always known. And I have seen him in times of difficulty and hardship, and what I've seen come out of him is faithfulness. I've seen him have to wrestle with his special needs son and go for 48 to 72 hours without sleep and then preach an incredible sermon and not use the realities of his life as an excuse. I've seen him have difficult hardship, times of discouragement, and what I see in him is faithfulness. I've seen him in times of victory and success, and what I see during those times is faithfulness. I've seen him go in the 10 plus years that I've known him, been working side by side with him, is I've seen the church triple in size and multiply itself around the world. And you know what I see? I see the same old faithful preacher. You know, I've seen people that are so grateful for what God has done in their life through Brad that they come up and they want to give him a lavish, lavish gift. I mean, lavish gift. And you know what he always says? He says, thank you so much. So grateful what God's doing for you. Why don't you instead take the equivalent of that gift and go put it in the offering? Thank you very much. I've just seen in good times and in times of difficulty, faithfulness, faithfulness, faithfulness. A few years back, there was a pastor in Austin that asked to come visit me. When he walked into my office, he actually plopped himself down in the chair, and the first things out of his mouth was, "What is the secret sauce at Austin Ridge?" In that one sentence, he was telling me, I'm exhausted. I'm not seeing the harvest that I think I should. And I don't know what you guys got going on over here, but I would really, really like to borrow it. Okay? I didn't know how to answer that question, but the thing that immediately came to mind is I sat right down next to him. And I said, here's what we believe. We sincerely believe in the sovereignty of God and the sufficiency of the scriptures. And that's it. That we're hanging everything on that. That God's always going to be God, and he's never going to stop doing God stuff, and he's never going to stop working out his agenda in human history. God's always going to be God. He's in control. He is sovereign. We're lucky. We're lucky to be riding his coattails with whatever he chooses to do around here. God is sovereign, and the scriptures are sufficient. The scriptures containing the gospel, which is the power of God that brings about salvation, freedom in our lives, they're sufficient, and they're our authority. We are not our own. That even as shepherds trying to shepherd a flock, we're trying to deny ourselves, take up our cross daily, and follow him. If there's a secret, that's just it. And listen, we've done that in the past, and we're going to do that in the future, and we've done that while things are good and when things aren't good, and there will be a time when things are not easy and things are not good, and it doesn't feel like the wind of the Spirit is at our back. And you know what? We're going to still trust that God is sovereign and the scriptures are sufficient. Because we're not trying to dazzle. We're not trying to attract. We're not trying to make things palatable. We're trying to share the truth and let the truth set people free. And sometimes that's in vogue, and sometimes it is so out of style. But it is desperately needed by the culture that we live in today. And so that's our mission. That's all that we're trying to do. Listen, congregation, church family, there will be a day when you want to hitch your wagon to a shooting star, where you want to find a gospel that's a bit more palatable, a bit more in line with the culture or popular belief. And I would say, don't fall for it. My heart is the same as the Apostle Paul's heart, is don't go there. Paul continues in verse number 11. Look what he says. He says, listen, church, I have spoken freely to you, Corinthians. My heart is wide open. So this is an emotional appeal again. But you know what Paul's doing here? He's being a good shepherd. He's being tough and bold and blunt with these people, but he's doing it from the right heart. He is being a great, great shepherd here. You know what being part of a church is? And we say this every time we have a partnership class. We're saying, here's what partnership is. Partnership is meaning you going through the process and you saying, hey, listen, we want to put ourselves under the authority of the shepherds here at this local church. We're giving you permission to shepherd us. And sometimes shepherding looks like comfort and encouragement, and sometimes shepherding looks like grabbing the face mask and shaking it and saying, come on, get your act together. This is not who you are. So this is an emotional appeal from Paul. And then he says in verse number 12, here's the truth, you are not restricted by us. You are restricted in your own what? Your own affections. He's saying you have divided hearts. You want Jesus, and you're also being enamored with persuasive rhetoric from these people, the TED Talks by these professional ministers, the rituals that they invite you to participate in because they make you feel more spiritual than just Jesus plus nothing. He says, you're falling for it. Don't fall for this. Don't fall for this. And then in verse number 13, he says, in return, he says, I've shared everything. In return, I speak to you as children. Widen your hearts also. In other words, he says, I poured my heart out to you. Now it's your move. It's your move. Ball's in your court. It's your move. But please, listen, Corinthian church, move now. Today is the favorable time. Today is the day of salvation. Why would you want to delay obedience to Jesus? Why would you want to extend disobedience knowing that it doesn't bring about the righteous life that was intended to you by God? He continues, verse number 14. He says, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. What partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? What fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. When he says don't be unequally yoked together with unbelievers, he's using a metaphor taken from a verse in Deuteronomy chapter 22, which says, hey, listen, when you're farming, when you're plowing, don't hitch together, don't yoke together an ox and an ass. Don't do that. He says those are two different animals, two different natures. He said they're not compatible. It won't be a good result. What he's trying to get across in this, listen, church body, you're different. Jesus has made you different. Be different. And don't connect in essential ways with people that are going to dilute your difference. He says the Christian is a different breed from somebody that does not follow God, that does not follow Jesus. The Christian is someone who says, my life is not my own. I've been bought with a price. Therefore, I should glorify God in my body and my spirit because they belong to him. A non-believer is somebody that says, no, I've got this. I've got it. My life is my life. It's my decisions. It's my time. It's my choices. It's my everything. I run my own life. And Paul is saying, listen, you would never say that you're not a Christian, that your life is your own, but this is the way you live because the grace of God comes in its various forms. And instead of following through in obedience, you just delay that obedience. You say no to that obedience. And you trust yourself instead of denying yourself. Now let me explain here this don't be yoked together with unbelievers. There's no call here for Christians to separate from other Christians for non-essential reasons. This is not a call for wholesale separation from non-believers. As a matter of fact, this verse, though it's not expressly talking about dating relationships and marriage relationships, I would say that the principle holds true and all of that kind of stuff, but it's not expressly talking about that. If it was, this metaphor, don't put together an ox and an ass, if you want to relate it to your marriage, then you have to decide which one is the ox and which one is the other. And so, but listen, Paul in his other writings has made it clear, hey, listen, if you're married to an unbeliever, do not separate just because they're an unbeliever. Don't do that. Paul has made it clear in other places that unbelievers are welcome at Christian gatherings and at Christian meetings. What he's trying to get across here is you are different. Live differently. Do not receive the grace of God in vain. Christianity is all that Jesus plus nothing. And here are these people that come in and they're whispering Jesus plus a little bit of this. And Jesus and add to him a little bit of that. And he says that doesn't work. And he says you call yourself Christian and we call ourselves Christian. And we attend a Christian church and we read and study Christian literature and we put Christian quotations on the walls of our house and the refrigerators in our homes. But so many times when God's grace visits us, and it prompts us to go this way instead of this way. When it prompts us, trust me and not your own inclinations. We live as though we're practical atheists, or we put our trust in ourselves and not him. Instead of denying self and taking up our cross and follow him, we want a little bit of Jesus and we want to stay masters of our own life, and we want two things that are not compatible. We want something that does not exist. I want you to look at all the promises of God here in the tail end, verse number 16. He quotes the Lord. He says this from the Old Testament, I will make my dwelling among you. This is how God wants to treat his people. I will make my dwelling among them and walk with them, and I will be their God. They will be my people. And therefore, here's what I want you to do. Go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord. Touch no unclean thing. And then, listen, here's a conditional promise. Then I will welcome you, and I will be a father to you, and you'll be sons and daughters of me, says the Lord Almighty. Listen, the love of God is unconditional. And many of the blessings of God are unconditional, but many of the blessings of God have condition that comes with them. This is one of them. He says, do this. In verse number 17, it says, then I will, and he uses these familial terms, welcome you, and I will be a father to you, and you will be my sons, you will be my daughters. You feel, this is the heart of a God that wants to dote on us like a loving dad would. You know, last Sunday was my daughter's birthday. She turned 30. I can't believe I've got a daughter that's 30 years old. And so we had a family meal celebrating her birthday, and like we do every meal, we had this tradition when they were in middle school. On their birthdays, we would always gather together as a family, and now they've gotten married, so our family's gotten bigger, but everybody was around the dining room table. And we all took turns speaking truth into our daughter. One of the gifts that we give the birthday person are words of affirmation. Here's how I see Jesus in you. Here's what I see in your life. And so we would all take turns doing that. And during that time of affirmation, or right afterwards, my son reminded me something that he grew up with. He says, Dad, I grew up with you saying to me, sometimes seriously with my arms on his shoulders, eyeball to eyeball, and sometimes jokingly when something would happen. But he says, I grew up with you saying, you are my beloved son in whom I am well pleased. And my daughter says, Dad, I grew up with you saying, you are my beloved daughter. I delight in you. And I still say that. I still sometimes grab her, kiss her on the top of the head and say, I delight in you. Just the heart of a dad towards kids, you just can't get enough of. And I've been honest with my children as they've grown up. We will always love you. As mom and dad, we can't turn love off. We love you. We really do love you. That's never going to stop. It is as much as humanly possible, that love is without condition. However, you can walk out from underneath the umbrella of our blessing. That can be true. Some blessings are conditional. God himself actually says, listen, children, I love you. I want to demonstrate my love in some life-changing, life-securing, life-giving ways. So don't stray from me. Don't walk away from me. Don't turn to your own devices, your own inclinations, your own wisdom. Stay here, my blessing. Listen, but that's your move. That's my move. God's grace will always visit us, but we can actually receive the grace of God in vain. Let's wrap up with that first verse of chapter 7. Here's what Paul says. Since then, since we have these promises, the promises that he just went over in chapter 6, over and over, since we have these promises, beloved, again, the heart of a dad, here's what I want you to do. Here's your assignment. Here's your takeaway. Here's your homework for the week. And listen, church, Austin Ridge Dripping Springs, here's your homework for the week. Look in verse number 7. Let us cleanse ourselves from every defilement of body and spirit. Let go of the things that you know, forfeit the grace of God in your life. Forfeit the power of God. Forfeit the blessing of God in your life. Let us cleanse ourselves from every defilement of body and spirit. Because you know what that would do? When we let go of the things that hold us back, when we let go of the things that are not God and God honoring in our life, you know what the natural result is? That last line, bringing holiness uniqueness, difference to completion in the fear of God. Let me ask you, why postpone obedience? Why? Why delay obedience to a God that wants nothing more than what's best for you? You that maybe have never trusted Jesus for salvation. You're still trying to manage your own goodness. Why would you push the grace of God away? Why not today? If today is the time of God's favor, if you sense Him prompting you, why would you delay that? Why not today? If today's the day of salvation, why would you delay that? So let me ask you to do this. Would you just bow your heads for a second? I'm going to give you just a minute. If you need to talk to God about something that you need to let go of, maybe it's a habit that you've developed in your life. Maybe it's an attitude towards Him. Maybe you've been bitter against Him. Maybe you've withheld forgiveness from somebody. Maybe there's this, whatever it is. Today is a day to make a decision. Say, Lord, I'd rather choose you. I don't want to forfeit the grace of God. I don't want to receive your grace in vain. But I would also say that real followership of Jesus doesn't happen through a decision. What really matters is kind of how you're going to live tomorrow morning when you get out of bed and walk through your week. Decisions are great, but unless that decision leads to a new direction in your life, denying self, taking up my cross, following Him, that's what's needed. Just talk to the Lord about that right now. And Father, we praise you for your goodness and the way that you love us in tender ways and in tough ways, in ways that encourage and in ways that shake us to the core, in ways where we're convinced of your goodness, and other ways we go, there's no way I could ever be happy if I let that thing go. We can trust that you're sovereign and that you're honest with us. So we entrust ourselves to you in Jesus' name.